The vitriol in the fight over Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination isn't just about the allegations against him. It's about a lot of things. In many ways, it's about the tribalism in our politics of today. And with everyone in their corners, how far apart we are from one another is stark. Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's defenders can't understand why Republicans would stand by someone accused of sexual assault. And Kavanaugh's supporters can't understand why Democrats think allegations from nearly 40 years ago should destroy someone's career. As Politico's editor-in-chief John Harris writes earlier this week, the mutual incomprehension shines a light on what has been one of the recurring themes of American politics for journalists of my generation, the human capacity to tolerate and even embrace small lies if they are in service of someone's larger truth. If you insist this phenomenon does not apply to you, the chances are you are lying at least to yourself. So let's look back at the history that got us here. The Cato Institute's Roger Pilon writes that the vote on Brett Kavanaugh won't solve America's deeper Supreme Court problems. So this is what I'm trying to get at. I'm joined now by the two authors of these columns, Politico editor-in-chief John Harris and Cato Institute vice president for legal affairs, Roger Pilon. And again, with you, John, talking about the specific versus the larger culture war that you want to go on. You really go back between Kavanaugh and Ken Starr and the Clinton and the fact that it's a mirror image argument that the Clinton defenders of 98 are making to Kavanaugh defenders of 18.
Well, the common theme is in both cases you had people saying, I can't possibly understand how the other side could tolerate this, how they could think this. And usually when you're in one of those situations where you can't possibly understand why people would think the exact opposite of you, it says we're not really in a political fight, we're in a cultural fight in which basic questions of identity are at stake. The point that I was making in that piece is Bill Clinton spent a year lying in pretty obvious ways over what happened with Monica Lewinsky.
And it was for short-term reasons, right? Well, maybe this is a way to get it off the page, or maybe this will get people from, right? What do you think the motivation was?
Well, sure. It was, well, I think in his case, he thought if he had just come forward and said, yes, I did have a relationship at the very beginning of that scandal, the public would not have been able to tolerate it, and the whole thing might have burned down. But if we could drag it out, let the truth emerge slowly, people were prepared to make a judgment about this. And, in fact, the literal truth of what he said, a lot of it being false, for his side, certainly never for Brett Kavanaugh on the other side, but for his side, the larger truth was more important. In that view, the larger truth was this is a partisan investigation, and sexual indiscretions and even lies about sexual indiscretions are not worthy of evicting a president. That was the large truth, and all the small lies didn't really make that much difference.
Roger, I was born in 1972. I lived my whole life in the culture war of American politics because I think about it. I was born the year of Watergate. Bork 15 years later, Clinton 10 years later, Kavanaugh. I mean, we are just. Is this just been one long? I mean, it seems to be that's the argument. We're in one long war here.
Chuck, I was born 30 years earlier, long before the culture war, and it was great. Let me say that the hearings that we've had, especially the first part of the hearings where we actually talked about substance rather than sex, were brought out how deeply divided, once again, how deeply divided we are as a nation, not simply about the role of government, but about the Constitution itself, the reading of the Constitution. And this divide goes way back. It goes back to the progressive era, when there was a fundamental...
You're taking me back to Teddy Roosevelt starting this thing.
I am taking you back to Teddy Roosevelt, to Woodrow Wilson, that great progressive, who saw the Constitution as a straitjacket. He resisted it. He didn't like it because it prevented him from doing the kinds of things he wanted to do. The progressives were social engineers. They wanted to change the world, especially in the political and economic and social area, through legislation. But of course, the Constitution that we had lived under, now going up to 150 years, was a Constitution for limited government and maximizing individual liberty. Things came to a head during the New Deal when Roosevelt's programs, one after another, were found unconstitutional. What happened then? In 1937, Roosevelt threatened to pack the court with 6 new members, the infamous court packing scheme. There was outrage in the country. Nevertheless, the court got the message, and he began rewriting the Constitution without benefit of amendment and opening the floodgates to the modern welfare state. It reduced economic liberty to a second-class status, and it opened the door for the Congress to delegate ever more of its powers to the executive branch, the modern executive state.
This is the Ben Sasse, the great Ben Sasse opening statement from the first part of the confirmation.
Ben Sasse is an historian.
Right,
Taught
which
history.
he made this case. We wouldn't be fighting this hard over a Supreme Court justice if Congress actually compromised.
That's right. And if we had more Ben Sasses in the Congress, believe me, we'd be a better place.
If Brett Kavanaugh hadn't worked for Ken Starr, would he be in an easier situation? Because there's part of this that says part of our culture wars is also in Washington. You can't let go of a grudge.
I think there's some of that, and we saw it the first time in his nomination 12 years ago for the appellate court judge. People remember his history. I don't think it's necessarily unfair to bring that history up, Chuck, and I do think God has a little bit of a sense of humor.
Oh, I know when you look at it. Okay, criminalize sex, and here we go, right?
And I think what Bill Clinton was basically saying to Ken Starr and all the people who were pursuing him back then is, come on, give me a break. You really want to pursue this? And that's exactly, and the answer then was, yes, we do, because we think there's something important involved. And now Kavanaugh is the one saying, come on, you're going to look at my history 36 years ago, give me a break. Is that relevant? Yes, we think it is. And I think the universe is more fair than unfair. Not every instance is fair, but long term, there's a lot of fairness, and Kavanaugh's experiencing that.
Right. You know, Roger, I guess the question is this sort of cold, I mean, on one hand, yes, the Supreme Court has been this vehicle to fight because we've decided, all right, it's going to decide whether legislation stays or goes. I mean, that's what we're going to do. But the larger issue of this culture war, we're at the point where one side, I don't think, would shed a tear if something happened to the other side. How do we bridge that divide?
I don't know that we can, frankly.
Should we? Should a robust democracy?
Where is the compromise when one side, call it the Bernie Sanders side of the Democratic Party, wants
the far left side. That is not a majority side.
Ever more government programs, and the other side, the Tea Party part of the base of the Republican Party. Remember, they marched in Washington with signs that said, "We want less." It's a long time since we've seen that. But the point is, when we had this culture war that you spoke of, coming out of the Supreme Court, finding itself again in the 50s, in the civil rights movement, rightly so, in criminal legislation and so forth, then it started finding rights that were nowhere to be found. And that created the conservative backlash. And the conservative backlash left us with two schools, conservatives calling for judicial restraint, liberals calling for judicial activism. And that's the situation that led that conservative backlash to Ronald Reagan, and to eventually things came to a head with the nomination of Robert Bork. And that's the start of the modern era of battle for the court.
John Harris, you have chronicled the scar tissue of American politics for a long time. What's this Kavanaugh scar going to look like in a decade?
You know, I think that this cultural war has lasted, as you say, since it's been going a good 4 or 5 decades now, and I think it's going to continue a good long while. A little bit of historical perspective, though. Chuck, when you were born in 1972, literally people were setting off bombs in campuses. Yeah. People were rioting in the streets. Really, and in the 30s, they were cracking heads over Union battles, and in the 1850s, people getting caned on the Senate floor. This is part of, I think, the American story, right? That there's violent passion.
You're trying to sell John Meacham's book? You're selling John Meacham's book quite well.
Sure, but the only thing that I think is different in this climate is that we've commercialized that kind of dissent. You can sell books off it, you can get ratings off it, you can raise money off it. I think that's a historically new phenomenon, the commercialization of extremism.
That is a great thing to stop this segment on. That's a great point for people to think about it. That bothers me a lot, people that have commercialized their outrage. Anyway, Roger Pilon, John Harris, thank you both. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.